Good evening. It's really a privilege for me to be here tonight. Also then as the first international speaker. This then means that you need to listen to a strange kind of English. So I hope that that works. And yeah, it's been such a wonderful few days for us here at Berry College. And it's an incredibly beautiful campus. And we have a little daughter and she's very impressed with the deer. We have lions and elephants, but we don't have any deer on our campuses. Yes, and the topic that I'd like to speak to today is on embodying reconciliation and justice. And I want to speak to that topic also in light of events in South Africa, South Africa's apartheid past. In 1978, there was a professor that asked his students at the University of the Western Cape a question. And the question that this professor asked to the students was the following one. What is theologically wrong with apartheid? Now this professor, his name was Jaap de Rand, and he was a white South African ostracized in his community for his critique of apartheid. He asked his black students, mostly people from mixed descent, this question, and they've, of course, experienced apartheid for themselves. It was part of their lives. Apartheid, as many of you will know, is the brutal system of oppression in South Africa that dehumanized black people. And also, if you take the word literally, it means, it's an Afrikaans word, it means the state of being apart, of being separate. So this logic of apartheid became pervasive within the South African society. And the question of this professor to these students who were all said to be ministers in their church was to reflect what is theologically wrong with apartheid. And one of the students in this class was a person that later on would become prominent as a pastor and a theologian in the anti-apartheid movement. His name is Russell Botman. Unfortunately, he died a few years ago, but he was also the president later on from the university where I now teach. And reflecting back on these classes with this professor and this pertinent question, what is theologically wrong with apartheid, he wrote the following. There to the right you will see, if you can see, the professor and then a picture of Professor Botman in the bottom corner. Now Botman then wrote, he says, as a student of Professor Jaap de Rand in the year 1978, I was challenged together with the rest of the class to come to a theological evaluation of the problem of apartheid. We refused to accept the usual legal argument, apartheid is a crime against humanity, or the political argument, apartheid is undemocratic, or the economic argument in condemning apartheid, that apartheid is the exploitation of human and nature resources. Together, he writes further, we revisited Karl Barth's theology. Eventually, our class arrived at the idea that apartheid takes its point of departure in the irreconcilability of people. That represented the theological center of the problem of apartheid. So by pressing the students to think theologically about apartheid, they realize that apartheid stands over against this idea that God reconciled humanity to God's self, and this made also reconciliation between people possible. So this idea then became a challenge to the sort of apartheid logic and the theological justification of the system. And with that, the realization that in supporting apartheid theologically, you are underwriting a false interpretation of the gospel, even a heresy, because it stands against what lies at the heart of the Christian tradition, namely reconciliation. And this idea was, of course, already earlier expressed, and I won't give a long lecture on the history of anti-apartheid theology in South Africa, but in the late 1960s, there was an influential document called The Message of the People of South Africa, and in that document, apartheid was then described as a pseudo-gospel, a false gospel. And I quote from that again: "There are alarming signs that this doctrine of separation has become for many a false faith, a novel gospel which offers happiness and peace for the community and the individual. It holds out to men a security built not on Christ, but on the theory of separation and the preservation of racial identity." So the basic point in this document, which was also criticized by the apartheid prime minister at that time, he was furious about the document and said the people are trying to be like Martin Luther King in the United States, and they must stay out of, the pastors must stay out of politics, because he realized that this goes against the moral and theological justification of the system that is built on the idea of separation. Now, this logic of separation has, of course, got deep roots back into South Africa's colonial history. And much can be said about that. And from the early time of the settlement in South Africa, the dominant church was the Dutch Reformed Church. And in the 19th century, this church, as it did mission work, had to grapple with a very specific question. And that is, what do they do with the people that they convert? Will these converts, out of what they call the heathendom, will they be incorporated into the existing communities, and will we celebrate the Lord's Supper together? Will we worship together? And of course, there were people that already had some racial attitudes at that time that wanted separate worship. So that the church grappled with these questions in the 19th century, and at a synod meeting in 1829, the synod said that Holy Communion be served simultaneously to all members, notwithstanding race or descent. So this idea was upheld. Christians worship together, not separated along racial lines. And so the conversation continued. And then in 1857, there was another synod meeting, and these issues again came to the fore. And then the synod took a new decision. And I'm going to read this decision. It said, "Synod regards it as desirable and scriptural that our members from the heathendom should be accepted and incorporated into our existing congregations." So the basic idea is, it's the ideal, it's scriptural, that people worship together, that they celebrate the Lord's Supper together. But then it goes on. But where this measure could, as a result of the weakness of some, obstruct the advance of the cause of Christ among the heathen, then congregations formed by those from heathendom, or which may still be formed, shall enjoy their Christian privileges in a separate building or institution. Now, I think you hear in this decision this idea that there's the rule, we should worship together and not racially segregated. But then there's this proviso saying that due to the weakness of some, that meant the white people with prejudices, we will make some excuses and exceptions. And as you know, with these kinds of exceptions, over time, the exception actually became the rule and the norm. And not long after this decision, there were mission churches starting, and you had ecclesial divisions among racial lines. And this became part in the 20th century of the mission policy of the Dutch Reformed Church. And if you read those documents, you will see that a very strong idea in these mission policies is this idea of no equalization of races. Because it's better for our mission work if people worship separately. And then there will be better growth within the churches if they are more homogeneous. And even in terms of the view of God that developed during this time, was this idea that God is actually the great separator, the great divider. And people would, some of these apartheid theologians who justified apartheid from Scripture would say, just look at the whole Bible is actually telling the story. You know, if you start at Genesis, what do we see happens? God divides land and sea, day and night, the creatures according to their kind. And at Babel, you see God's judgment at this human project of unification. And people, God separate them again. So this was the kind of logic. But of course, people also realized, and this was also the message of many of the missionaries, that Jesus died for all. And that if we take the gospel seriously, we should speak about the equality of believers. By the way, anyone who wants to read on the racial history of South Africa as it relates to the church and to theology, I recommend this book by Richard Elphick called The Equality of Believers. But the point that I want to make is that we see how this movement then develops. So when those students that I mentioned in the class who were challenged with the question, what is theologically wrong with apartheid, when they realized that it's against the gospel of reconciliation, they didn't leave it at that. But they asked the professors to help them, and they sent a resolution to the synod of their church, the Dutch Reformed Mission Church. And that actually led to that synod in 1978 saying that apartheid and the justification thereof is against the gospel. And within time and with other voices adding to that, people in 1982 accepted a confession that had at its heart this message of reconciliation. And I want just to bring that to your attention. This confession that was accepted by the church in 1982 as a draft confession, and in 1986 as a official confession of the church, is called the Belhar Confession. I don't know if anybody have heard about that confession before. I'm tempted to ask, but some of you might have heard about it. It's also been accepted by some churches in the United States as part of their confessional base. Belhar, that is a town where mostly so-called colored people live, people of mixed descent. It's near the Cape Town airport, and that is where this confession was accepted by the synod. Now, what is the message of this confession? And if one reads this confession, and you can find it online, you will see that it's, although it doesn't mention apartheid by name, it's a theological critique of the type of theology and ideas that underwrites the apartheid policy and mindset. And basically, one can divide this confession, the Belhar Confession, into to 5 articles or 5 sections. And basically, in the first section, you have the expression of the belief in the triune God who gathers the church. So it works with a Trinitarian ecclesiology. And then it goes on to confess belief in the unity of the church. And then in the next article, in the on the reconciliation in Christ. And then there's a 4th article dealing with the issue of justice. and then a concluding word that says we are called to this in obedience to Christ as our Lord, linking it to the primary Christian confession that Jesus is the Lord, and linking it to the implication thereof. Now, why is this confession important when we speak about the theological response to South Africa's apartheid past? Let me just say then something quickly on these notions that lies at the heart of the Ballard Confession. Now, if we take this history of segregation and separation, one can understand that it was important for these churches that has become racially divided to think about the unity of the church. We believe that Christ is one, that the church is one, that we have one baptism, that we share in the one bread. And so this emphasis on unity became important. And the understanding was that the unity that already exists in Christ must become visible. It's not just an abstract unity. It must become visible for the witness of the church, so that the world may believe that separation, enmity, and hatred between people and groups is sin. That this hostility and hatred and bitterness is sin. And that diversity is a gift, but that we can't use this talk of diversity as a way to justify separation. But so this strong emphasis in the Ballard Confession on the importance of visible unity. And then the second aspect relates then to the notion of reconciliation. And if you take that remark at the beginning and keep that in mind, you can see that this forms the heart of this confession. So basically in the Ballard Confession, the claim is made that God, by his life-giving word and spirit, has conquered the powers of sin and death, and therefore also of irreconciliation and hatred, bitterness and enmity. Hence the rejection of any doctrine that sanctions in the name of the gospel or of the will of God the forced separation of people on grounds of race and color. Such a doctrine obstructs and weakens the ministry and experience of reconciliation. So you hear some of these ideas that I mentioned, that this word of reconciliation exposes then apartheid theology as a false doctrine, in fact as a heresy. And therefore people during that time confessed these words with their hearts, because they realized that they can't be Christians and not confess to Christ against what was viewed as a false gospel. And therefore there's a strong emphasis that a moment of truth has arisen for the church, in which the church cannot keep silent, but have to speak if it wants to be faithful as a church against this sort of false gospel that has become pervasive within society. So the confession then also realized that if people are visibly united, they need to deal with the past, so there's the need for reconciliation. But there was also the sense that we should not separate reconciliation from justice, because people experience the pain in their own bodies of the injustices of apartheid, the trauma it caused, the dehumanization. And therefore, they felt the need to confess that the God of the Bible is the God that reconciles, and this God is the God of justice. Therefore, we read in this confession, we believe that God has revealed God's self as the one who wishes to bring justice and true peace, that in a world full of injustice, God is in a special way the God of the destitute, the poor, and the wrong. and calls the church to follow him in this. That the church, as the possession of God, must stand where God stands, namely against injustice and with the wronged. That in following Christ, the church must witness against all the powerful and privileged who selfishly seek their own interest. So you hear within this part of the confession this very important emphasis that as church we should have solidarity with those who are wronged, who are suffering under the injustices. Not merely for ideological reasons, but because we understand something of the heart of God. Because God is the God of justice, who identifies with those who are helpless and in need. So this became the focus then of the Bellhar Confession, and a lot of the theological discourse in the 1980s in South Africa circled around these notions of unity, reconciliation, and justice. And those of you who are familiar with the South African history of the time will know that towards the end of the 1980s, beginning of the 1990s, there was a relatively peaceful transition to democracy with the first democratic elections in 1994 and Nelson Mandela being inaugurated as the first president of a truly democratic society. Now, for us who lived through that was a wonderful event. I often feel that the words that describe this quite well is words by the poet Seamus Heaney that he actually wrote for Nelson Mandela that says, history says, don't hope. And we know that is true on this side of the grave. But then, once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. That was a bit the experience of many South Africans during that time of the elections in 1994, and experiencing how people that were enemies became reconciled, and that there was a positive feeling of reconciliation among people. But of course, already at that time, people knew that for reconciliation to be sustainable and that the society be a society of justice, one needs to engage with the past. Because, as you know, the past is not dead, in William Faulkner's words. It is not even past. It keeps haunting us. It stays present. So we need to engage with the presence of the past in our lives and in our communities. And therefore, the decision, Jonathan asked me to say something about that. The decision was then that for us to move forward, also in light of the injustices of the past, one needs to face it. One needs to deal with the pain and the injustices of the past. And therefore, under the chairpersonship of Desmond Tutu, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established. And basically, the idea of this commission was that people can come and testify before the commission, and that they need to disclose what happened, the crimes that they committed. Many of the people that came were responsible for killing people that were in the anti-apartheid struggle, or for planting bombs and so on. So there was a lot of emotion. People had deep traumas, deep experiences. And so people came and testified before the commission, and if they disclosed the truth, then they could receive amnesty for that. And maybe this catharsis in society could then contribute to the healing of the society. Now, of course, many people were also critical of this because people can misuse it. They can just use this as a way of not being persecuted and prosecuted and so on. So a lot of people became skeptical if this commission will, and this testimony will lead to reconciliation? Can that gap that's presented here, can it be crossed in a way that leads to deep change? So more and more people also, after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, even people who were positive about the work of the Commission, realized that it's not enough, that the journey towards reconciliation is not finished. It didn't finish when this commission finished compiling its report and handed it over to the president. But it's a continuing journey, and that people must continue on this journey, and that we should realize that this notion of reconciliation is actually a very contested notion. I quote here from a book published several years after the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And it expressed this idea of the ambivalence of this notion of reconciliation and the role it played within the South African society. As Fanny de Tooy and Eric Dockstatter, the editors, write in the editorial introduction, it is possible that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission taught us a great deal about reconciliation's value, and at the same time did not teach us a great deal about how to carry on the process ourselves. Today we have likely, this was in 2006 that they wrote this, today we have likely grown a bit tired of listening to the debates over reconciliation's promise. And yet at the same time, we still hear the Commission's profound claim that reconciliation is fundamental for the development of a just society. Sometimes we think of it as our most prized idea, the next moment as a cheap deception. This captures something of this ambivalence. This question of this language of reconciliation, is it not cheap language to use in a country with the deep pain and injustices that societies that went through deep conflict experienced? And furthermore, that in the South African society, these concepts like reconciliation, forgiveness, justice are often racialized concepts. White people want to speak about reconciliation and forgiveness, while black people want to speak about justice and restitution. How do we deal with this? So the important thing to keep in mind is that, and to make this point, that in grappling with this notion of reconciliation, the notion of justice, that we realize that this is an unfinished journey. Desmond Tutu, the chairperson of the Truth and Reconciliation, said that we are charged to unearth the truth about our dark past, to lay the ghost of the past so that they will not return to haunt us. So this was the hope also for the Commission, that we face the past, that we deal with the injustices. You can't get rid of these ghosts just by calling a few ghostbusters. You need to grapple with the past. You need to face the ghosts of the past, and this is often very, very painful. And as Mampela Rampele, a well-known South African public intellectual, she wrote this book called Laying Ghosts to Rest, and she said that these ghosts of the past, they are, with stubborn ghosts. They are not chased away that easily. And the ghosts that she described as stubborn ghosts, these are the ghosts of racism, ethnic chauvinism, sexism, authoritarianism. They are not scared so easily. And therefore we need to grapple with them on a deep level. Sometimes we think that we've chased them away, but they are stubborn. They return, and we need to continually engage with these ghosts. And in the current South African context, we are experiencing that. At the university where I teach, the last few years, there's been a lot of protests. And these protests has actually rose up in light of the fact that the systemic injustices of the past were not addressed deeply enough. That the type of slow violence of the unjust structures and the economic inequality led to the feeling of people that they are still not treated with dignity, that their lives still doesn't matter. And at the university level, people addressed that. They pleaded for the decolonization of the curriculum, challenged the spaces and the way that it makes people feel unwelcome. And often now in the last year or so, the question of violence was also addressed on the campuses. There's been vandalism, buildings have been burned, people have been attacked. Also, it happened that some of the students that protested were shot by the police with rubber bullets, and they responded against to the violence of the security personnel. So it's been a tough time, and many of these universities actually been closed down for the year, and we had the suspension of classes. So I'm saying this because just to say that this is facing the ghost of the past. It is not unimportant, and to deal and to just to claim cheap reconciliation is not enough. So what is the theological challenge during this time, a time like this? And as many people have said, how do we challenge this understanding in which we make reconciliation cheap? Because we separate it from the quest for justice for all. On the other hand, we also know that vengeance and a vengeful justice is not the answer, because it keeps us in prison. And by hating, by staying in perpetual hostility to others, we don't just destroy others, but we also destroy ourselves in the process. So many theologians has written during this time on reconciliation. Jonathan already mentioned the book by John de Gruchy, and he made this point, that we should realize that reconciliation and forgiveness, the language of these words can become cheap if we don't realize this link between reconciliation and justice. In fact, as he argues, that we realize that reconciliation is actually restored justice. It's the process in which we try to restore what was wrong, so keep these notions close to each other. So the point that some South Africans have made is that we should be careful on the one hand of cheap reconciliation, and on the other hand of vengeance. And here I quote an important South African writer. Her name is Pumla Gobodo-Madikizela. She worked for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. She has reflected on these ideas of trauma, of forgiveness, of remorse, of justice. And she wrote in one of her books, South Africa faces the challenge of how to embrace the past without being swallowed by the tide of vengeful thinking. If memory is kept alive to cultivate old hatreds and resentments, it is likely to culminate in vengeance. But if memory is kept alive in order to transcend hateful emotions, then remembering can be healing. So you hear within that quotation this focus that we should not let our memories, our engagement with the past, keep us in prison. And actually, her work is remarkable in the sense that she wrote a book, and it's at the back right, Jonathan. The book is called A Human Being Died That Night. in this book, she tells of her experiences of interviewing a person with the name of Eugene de Kock. And he was the most infamous apartheid assassin who killed people that resisted apartheid. And he was viewed, his nickname became Prime Evil, because for many people in South Africa, he was the embodiment of evil. And what Pumla Gabuda Marikizela did is that he didn't receive amnesty at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, so she went to interview him for 46 hours in prison over a period of 6 months and established a human relationship with him and tried to recognize the humanity in this apartheid killer. And that book is a testimony of that, and it's also been made into a play, award-winning play. But the point of Gabuda Marikizela is that it's really important that for reconciliation we recognize the humanity of the other, and that we have to have this empathy with the other, to say that the other person shares my humanity. But also she warned that this is not enough. And if I can quote her again, the lesson of the Truth and Reconciliation is that one shouldn't settle for utterances of apology and symbolic gestures of forgiveness and reconciliation. Instead, this transformative moment should be used to address strategies for real change. If the greater challenge of economic transformation is not met, what has already been achieved in South Africa could be lost. The next revolution might not necessarily be a racial one, but one in which the masses rise against the new breed of beneficiaries of privilege. Now, what Gabuda Marikizela is saying here is within this processes of reconciliation, there is opportunities. There are moments in which reconciliation can happen, but that we must use these opportunities, and that we must use these opportunities to address the deep injustices in our societies. Otherwise, they will come back to haunt us. Let me, in the last part of the paper, just make two quick points, and I'll try to be brief. When we say that we need to engage with the past, that we need to remember the past in a certain way, I think it is important that we realize that we remember together, in proximity with one each other, that we share our stories, that we open ourselves to the lives of others, and that we resist polarization. I think we live in a time of growing polarization, and even a new type of tribalism, where people feel that they want to withdraw in their new group identities. And a lot of what is happening in our world today is fueled by this new polarization that we are experiencing in our globalizing world, and it's accompanied often by violence, also religious violence. And often this kind of polarization works with what the Jewish rabbi, the Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, in his book that I really can recommend, Not in God's Name, called Pathological Dualism. Now, what is pathological dualism? He writes about that. It is this view that violence may be possible wherever there is us and them. We know that creates, if we have kids, we know that there's a us and a them, and how violence can happen. But then he goes on to say, radical violence emerges only when we see the us as all good and the them as all evil, heralding a war between the children of light and the children of darkness. And we know that often in our political discourse we work with this kind of dualism, where we work with this idea of all good and all bad, and this fuels further polarization. And really, if we take reconciliation and justice discourse seriously, we need to resist this kind of polarization and open ourselves up to the idea of role reversal. of really be able to see the humanity in the other and realize that there's a brother in the other and also an other in the brother and sister. And I think this is quite important. A second remark is that when we speak about dealing with the past, that we realize that we should face the past in a truthful way, that we should deal with the realities of the past, even if it's painful, and don't shy away from that. But that we realize that for reconciliation and for peace and justice in society, we need a different kind of memory. Not the type of memory that is just interested in what happened so that we can blame others and excuse ourselves. Or that we can think that we just want to get done with this so that we can go on with our own separate lives. No, this is the type of remembering that remembers with the future in mind. So we deal with the past because we realize that we see a common future. If you don't want or don't have a vision of a reconciled community, also along racial lines, then you will remember the past in a certain way. You will remember certain things or highlight them. But if you remember look at back at the past with this idea that we have a vision of a shared humanity, a shared future, then you will deal with the past in a different way. And my point, maybe the main point for this lecture, is that means that we will not separate our discourse on reconciliation from that of justice. And with the future in mind, we will realize that reconciliation is something costly, that forgiveness is difficult but not impossible, and that the justice is not a mere punitive justice or vengeful justice, but restorative and transformative. And this remembering with the future in mind, one of my favorite theologians is the German theologian Dietrich Bonheoffer, and he realized that we need to ask this question not just about ourselves, but ask this deep ethical question about how the coming generation is to go on living. And I think this is the important point for a future-orientated memory, that we also know that the work that we are doing now in terms of embodying justice, embodying reconciliation, that might not be so important even for us. But if we think about the future of our children, then our lives and our discipleship will exhibit certain virtues, certain commitments now, in this moment, because we realize that we are called to embody justice. So to conclude and to go back to that question I asked right at the beginning of the talk, what is theologically wrong with apartheid? Maybe extend it to what some has called the new global apartheid, the new tribalism, the new polarization, the new hardening of identities that we are experiencing in our globalized world. And I think this will mean, to use the language also of the Ballard Confession, that we say no to this logic of separation and polarization, because that's what's wrong with this logic of global apartheid, and say yes for visible unity. That we say no for enmity and hostility and vengeance, and say yes to reconciliation. That we say no to self-interest and survival, and yes to justice. And that when we speak about survival, we don't see that as the highest good, but that we seek to survive in justice. And that is quite important. Maybe I can just quote one American theologian here. He's a Catholic. His name is Bruce Springsteen. And one of his songs is from his album Devils and Dust, makes this point. He says, I got God on my side. I'm just trying to survive. What if what you do to survive kills the things you love? Fear is a powerful thing. It can turn your heart black you can trust. It will take your God-filled soul and fill it with devils and dust. I think this is the point to say that when we speak about reconciliation, about justice, it is basically challenging this language of separation, of fear, and to venture into a new direction. To conclude, I'd like just to say that this year it's been 30 years in South Africa since the official acceptance of the Belhar Confession. And one of the drafters of the confession, actually one of my colleagues, Professor Dirkie Smit, he last month preached on this occasion where the church celebrated the 30th anniversary of the Belhar Confession. And there he made this point, and I just quote from the second paragraph. We say yes to unity, and therefore often here have to say no to whatever rejects and despises unity. Whoever can live with exclusion and division and conflict and separation. We say yes to reconciliation, and therefore often have to say no, even to the bitterness in our own hearts, to memories filled with anger, the feelings of revenge, the ongoing experiences of disappointment. We say yes to compassion and justice, and therefore often say no to every form of injustice and inequality and abuse and neglect and apathy to those who suffer. When we commemorate, and this is a word to us trying to embody justice and reconciliation in South Africa, when we commemorate Belhar these days after 30 years or more, the question is whether we have been faithful in giving an account of the hope within us. The question is not whether we have been no-sayers, although that was necessary and that remains. The real question is whether we have been yes-sayers, whether people could hear and see our yes, our love, our hope in God's humanity and compassion, our own compassion for unity, for reconciliation, for justice, and for these together. So the question posed is, do we embody reconciliation and justice? And that this is very difficult for us, and that we are called to do this in our different contexts. And in our struggles, we also have this problem, this promise that the God of justice, the God of reconciliation, will accompany us. May God bless you in embodying reconciliation and justice in the context in which you live. Thank you very much.